Central Bank of Montenegro. Mr. J. Tikan, Fintech and Risk Consultant Expert, CEO of Vedanvi company from UK. And we have also Mr. Milošević, CEO of Leka, Montenegro. So welcome. I suggest to start with the Vice Governor. So, Zorica, could you please tell us more what were the main motivation and driver for the Central Bank of Montenegro to establish this project, and what is the main goal that you expect?
Thank you, Valentina. First of all, I would like to thank the audience for taking part in today's meetup dedicated to development of the fintech strategy in Montenegro. I would say that this strong interest is additionally an indicator that holistic fintech strategy is very much needed in our country. When it comes to reasons why we are embarking in creation of the fintech strategy, I would say the time is now. There are many different, I would say, multifaceted layers and reasons behind that are coming together and that are now pushing toward the creation of the strategy. First of which being digital transformation per se, which accelerated by COVID, has laid the foundations for a brand new, I would say, workplace culture, revolutionary way in approaching customer service, and a more engaging user experience. In addition, I would say the digitalization in the context of financial system in Montenegro pushed a change in business model of banks, put more light on better understanding of customer needs, and I would say is pushing modernization of our financial system, which is, I would say, in the heart of the main reason why we want to create this strategy, namely what we want to see in Montenegro in the coming period is modern, vibrant, and efficient financial system. And definitely we cannot rely solely on traditional banks, and definitely the sooner the banks start cooperating with fintech and the sooner they start to embark in enhancing the access to financial products to their customer, the better when it comes to overall economy in Montenegro. So I would say the second motive for developing this strategy is really to enhance the access to financial products to, I would say, large audience, which is now not the case, which will have a positive spillover effect on overall economy. The second, I would say, reason which is pushing the creation of this strategy is, I would say, change in regulatory framework. As you may have already seen, the Central Bank of Montenegro submitted to the Parliament a new law on payment system, so-called PSD2 directive, which in core has the encouragement of innovation in financial industry. I would say that the main areas of PSD, which relates to customer authentication, data security, and third-party access to customer accounts, are three very, very strong pillars that are pushing development on fintech. The third rationale behind is that we are observing that both the government and the regulators are driving initiatives to create regulatory certainty and more openness to fintech innovators. However, I would say that all our initiatives, when it comes to regulators, I'm counting the Central Bank of Montenegro as well, have, I would say, a very, very sound initiatives. However, those initiatives are not coherent, and that is something that we want to achieve with this strategy. Of course, there is a long way ahead of us. I would say that there are many challenges. I will mention just a few of them. First of all, when it comes to ICT sector, but maybe Miloš could say a bit more on that, there is still lacking a strategic vision when it comes to, I would say, development of ICT sector in Montenegro as a whole, not solely related to fintech development of fintech market. The second challenge is, as I have already mentioned, the dialogue, collaboration, and consensus among key stakeholders is still lacking. As I said, we have excellent initiatives. However, they are, I would say, they're propelling the goals of each of stakeholder, and the lacking part is, I would say, joint communication and better collaboration. In addition, what we are observing is, I would say, a lackluster access to capital and resources, which is both of which are pivotal in assuring startups survival and their scale to business. And in final, at the moment at universities, they are still missing strengthening the curricula industries related to industries that are focused on fintech. So I would say that we have now at the moment a relatively sound regulatory framework, a relatively sound initiatives coming from regulators and from the government. We are having a blooming fintech industry. I would just mention that in 2019 we didn't have one fintech company, at least it was not on our radar. Now we have 9 of them. So in that aspect, we firmly believe that the main ingredients are there. What we are lacking is to create, I would say, a wholesome infrastructure, and we do hope that the fintech strategy is a solution that will, I would say, pinpoint and strengthen the ownership of key stakeholders within the fintech ecosystem, that will be pushing the fintech agenda toward creating, as I already said, an efficient and vibrant financial sector. In that regard, the central bank took, I would say, the leadership in this process together with the Ministry of Finance. We requested funds from the European Fund for Southeastern Europe. And in that aspect, it is my honor to have Mr. J. Tikam on our side that will help us create the strategy that I would say is unique for our small markets. And I think that his perspective from the international, having in mind, I would say, international experience will be pivotal in creating an efficient and applicable fintech strategy. In that aspect, what I have already heard from Mr. Tikam, that many countries created neatly written fintech strategies, but when it comes to implementation, the outcome was lackluster. That this is something that we want to avoid, and one of the reasons why we invite such a large audience from the very inception of the fintech strategy is to, I would say, listen to all key stakeholders and to avoid such a scenario. We want applicable and efficient fintech strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Zorica. So we have heard opinion from the regulator. Milos, what IT community expects from this strategy? Could you please share with us?
Hello everyone. So, the first thing, I guess that we have a first milestone that is behind us, and that's that the Central Bank of Montenegro has really opened its doors for the first time, I would say, on this large scale, in a sense to actually discuss about these topics and not to create legislations that are completely not taking into consideration the market or the industry or the requirements and everything else. And I think that that's already a step that is really something that we are very happy about. And of course, everybody wants everything to be done day one, but these things take some time, and it's actually very important that we do it right. We have many situations in the region and other countries of very dubious implementations of different fintech strategies or implementations of instant payment or PSD2 that took a while, didn't take off properly, and that they're back to square one and repairing things that they didn't construct properly from the day one. So that's something that is very helpful if we are to listen and to see what has happened in each nation, try to apply to a certain extent, and obviously keep ourselves as something as a small market, as Zorica mentioned, our specifics that are, of course, there are some things that apply possibly only to us and so on. So in terms of, as she said, there is a wish for creation of a modern and vibrant financial ecosystem, as she said, but that's something that obviously requires a standardization and infrastructure, and obviously this part where each stakeholder has been pulling in their own interest the strategy or the laws and everything else. That's something that definitely needs to stop, and in a way to that we all get around the same table and propel this towards something that will work for us in the future, and not just for some short-term goals. So to that extent, I would maybe separate the expectations of the IT industry in two parts possibly, and one is we have the part of IT industry that needs to implement certain I would say softwares or applications within different verticals, so different industries, and that's one thing that is very important. That means that the whole economy is in a way depending on the implementation of this, and that's, you know, like talking about if you can speak from the public administration to get all our taxes and other things that can be done online, and that we can get recognized on distance and do the KYC with the banks and actually get registered and open an account, which is a legislation problem that exists as of now. So requirement of a wet signature that has been quite a bit lagging behind all the laws on electronic signature. Then obviously implementation of e-commerce on a large scale, so wide acceptance of standards and solutions for e-commerce that can work from the public administration to legal entities and the private sector, so that these forms of payment become a norm rather than something that is very seldom and trials that don't really work to the full extent. And so many things, and implementation of this workspace where big companies that already have solutions can come in and actually work and operate normally in Montenegro if there is any commercial interest. But in any case, that's one, I would say, interest. So to actually propel various verticals of the economy, so that we don't go through very, very difficult procedures to actually get things going, and that the procedures are clear and the same for everyone. So that's one thing. And I would say that the second one from the IT industry would be those who are aspiring to go into the fintech area and build their own products. So whether they're going to become a payment institution or e-money institution, those do require different, I would say, framework that gets a little bit more relaxed than it is right now, and the things are common and common standards and known from day one. So one of the initiatives for that is the PSD2 directive that Zorica has been talking about, which is very important. That to those who are not, of course, there are three pillars that she has been talking about, but to make it very simple for the audience, it can help us make basically an application that lets you manage money that you have in different banks. So you can have a layer on top that is a fintech app that actually connects to all your banking accounts and is your banking application that allows you to manage money and do many things with it without actually using any of the software solutions that the banks themselves provide. So opening APIs, having a clear procedure about this, getting the banks to accept it and not to prolong the process as they did in the European Union on implementation of PSD2 with an excuse that it's a long and difficult process to actually change their core banking service and keep the security on a high level and everything else. All our commercial banks are very much aware of this for the last 5+ years. And so there is absolutely no excuse for them not to get prepared on time and provide APIs to the third parties who get an approval. So so the question here is how strong the Central Bank of Montenegro is going to be in propelling the mandate for them to actually get in line and get prepared for all these things. That obviously is in line also with instant payments, so with the clearing that actually are all these payment systems that in a way can work in parallel together with the card schemes of MasterCard, Visa, and other brands, of course, but it lets us to work 24 hours in real time, do these transactions between people, to pay for goods, pay for services, exchange the money, and make some value. So that's something that is, I would say, on a broad scale, the acceptance, of course, expectations of the IT industry. I would suggest as well to reconsider possibly the tiers that exist for payment institutions and e-money institutions. That is 150K for payment institutions and 350 for 350,000 euros of capital to start an e-money institution, and would rather think of a model that actually goes in tiers, that there are certain payment institutions that need to go from one tier to the other once they get the approval, but that the onboarding from day one is easy with a lower risk. So that would, in a way, get innovators more on board, because there is another issue that is a problem with us. That means that if you have a startup that wants to go into fintech and wants to have a digital wallet, so to speak, the first thing to solve without anything else to think about is a 350K to start with. And that means access to money. And that also means access to investors, to VC funds and everything, which is the whole another issue of things that is a problem in Montenegro. So I would suggest not to remove this, but actually to separate it in more tiers, that certain activities of e-money institutions up to a certain extent, up to certain risk that can be tolerated and accepted, can be something that could be part of the strategy for the smaller market that doesn't have access to funds from the outside. So that would be my 2 cents on in general.
Thank you, Miloš. So, Mr. Tikam, now can you tell us more about that journey, how to develop actually national fintech strategy, and what is the methodology can be used on this small market, as we heard right now. But before that, maybe you can just give short introduction about yourself for those participants that maybe didn't have opportunity to meet you or to listen to your very interesting presentations that we enjoyed. So please.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you, Zorica and Milos as well. Thank you for the kind welcome. So yeah, if you haven't met me, I think some of you have actually recognized, but if you haven't met me, so I'm Jay Tikam. I'm based in London. I run a consultancy called Vedunvi, and we mainly work with emerging markets, through these sort of development agencies. And we work across the ecosystem. So either helping where the fintech ecosystem is not well developed, we'll work with sort of government and regulators to kind of open up the landscape. In markets where things are more advanced, we would work with startup organizations and help them kind of grow and scale. And obviously, the big purpose we have is to drive kind of financial accessibility. I don't say inclusion, because nowadays most people have a bank account, but they still can't get access to finance. So the main driver for what we do is to create financial accessibility in these emerging markets, which are really quite interesting. I think places like London are very saturated. Places like your markets are starting to grow, and you'll see some very exciting changes that are happening further down the line. So yeah, I mean, at the moment, I'm doing work also in your region. I know your region fairly well. I'm currently working in Moldova as well as North Macedonia, in addition to Montenegro. And I also work across Middle East and Africa. So, quite a wide sort of diversity. I've personally have about 25 years of experience in financial services. Been in financial services all of my career. And since the beginning of fintech, I sort of switched into the fintech sector, just specializing in that space, because I felt that fintech was going to bring about a rapid change. So that's kind of us. I'll just take you through a brief presentation, just to take you on the journey we're going on. And as Zorica mentioned, I'm helping Montenegro to develop this fintech strategy. And the good news, as Zorica mentioned, is that the building blocks are in place. All we got to make sure is that everything comes together. That's kind of where I come in, and that's where you come in, and that's why we have this meeting today, is to get your input, because we don't want to do this in an ivory tower in isolation. We want to actually understand what's going on the ground, and then come up with a strategy that's going to work firstly, but also we're going to come up with structures that will make sure that things get implemented. So let me take you through a presentation, and then I'll be open to any questions that you have. I'm sure in addition to Melissa and Zorica as well, as well as Valentina. So you should be able to see my screen in a minute.
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is basically just the rationale, and I think Zorica kindly already mentioned a lot of the rationale for embarking on a fintech strategy, but we'll take a closer look at kind of some of the benefits that can bring, and hopefully that excites you to be part of this journey. Then we'll take you through the process of, okay, how are we going about developing this national fintech strategy? In some cases, as Zorica mentioned, these end up being documents that are sort of theoretically based and never get implemented because sometimes it's divorced from the reality. Obviously, we're trying to change that. So I'll take you on the journey of what the next steps are. And then, as we're running a survey, which I'm pleasantly surprised that we're having some really good responses. And I'll take you through basically the results we're getting so far, and kind of just the gist of the information. The surveys are open until Friday. So I'll just give you a snapshot of what things look like at the moment. Okay, so what the rationale basically for a fintech-led strategy, and I think obviously this is kind of I would say modernization is probably one word to use, but it's also alignment with international best practice. Fintech, in the early days was really something very new. People were very skeptical. It's now become mainstream. So what are the benefits it brings? I think, if you look at consumers, and if you look at small businesses, they really do get a lot of choice, because you get more players coming into the market, providing greater level of financial services products and services, which then allow people. So e-commerce is a good example. Sometimes it's very hard to get a merchant account at a bank, but fintech companies come in, remove those barriers. It now becomes really easy for a one-man entrepreneur to launch an e-store and take payments online. And so that's obviously quite revolutionary, but also it brings access to people who couldn't get. So even in a place like London, for example, for a young person to get insurance for their car is hugely expensive, and they're almost kind of shut out of that market. So fintech companies come in, they try and remove some of these barriers, and they make it easier for people to get access to insurance products, to loans, home loans, etc. And they're really overcoming barriers that banks find, and there's reason why they can do that, because they use a technology which brings down costs and kind of smooths out the process. So really, the end consumer benefits, and that's a good thing. If they benefit, then generally the economy will benefit overall. The second thing is, as we already suggested, is the whole process where you get more access to finance. If smaller businesses get access to finance, they'll end up growing. If they grow, they'll end up creating more employment, and the whole economy benefits. So it's a bit of a cycle, cyclical effect. The third one, interesting, every time I speak to people in your region, not just in Montenegro, but across the region, everyone says, our market's too small. So we need to go into Europe and start a fintech business there. Now, firstly, I will say that, every market has gaps that banks leave behind, because banks cannot sort of always tap into some of the markets that are slightly less profitable because they have a very high cost base. And therefore, there are, even in a market like yours, there will be opportunities that entrepreneurs can spot. But more importantly, I think, you can set yourself up as a fintech jurisdiction that's attractive for foreign fintech firms and sort of bring people from the outside in. You've got great weather. I've toured Montenegro, and you've got some really nice beaches and holiday destination. How nice would it be for a fintech entrepreneur to come there and launch a business, stay there for a few months a year. So that's one option. The other option is, there's a huge lack of skills in fintech. And again, Montenegro could set themselves up to be sort of the fintech outsourcing or preferred outsourcing destination and send skills outward. Now, I know there's some controversial issues there regarding, if people are outsourcing, then potentially there's less skills for firms to use internally in the in-market. But it's a bit of a balance, right? Because you'll get foreign direct investment coming in, but you also get more job creation through that process. And lastly, by having more players in the market, you increase the breadth of the financial system. So you have more players, therefore, if one or two players fail, it won't result in the whole sort of collapse of the economy. So these are some of the sort of macro level benefits. And, in light of that, you'll see that many countries are embarking on some sort of a fintech strategy. So the UK has got their fintech strategy, which they published in 2018, but they've been working on this since 2013. Malta is an interesting environment. Malta, initially, they sort of positioned themselves as a crypto hub or a blockchain hub. And I think they managed to attract Binance, which Binance is one of the biggest crypto exchanges in the world. And so Binance headquartered in Malta because, the conditions were favorable. Egypt, if you look at the other side of the world, Egypt and the central bank in Egypt has sort of launched their fintech strategy. Estonia and Lithuania are sort of the beacons, they're really making good progress. And Lithuania markets themselves as a gateway into Europe. So because they're part of the European Union, they are actually marketing themselves for people to come in, get a license in Lithuania, and use Lithuania as a base to expand into Europe. Their licensing process is slightly easier than if you were to go into Germany, for example. So that is the core strategy. They're trying to attract firms into Lithuania from the outside, and then helping them to expand into the rest of Europe. And I've been sort of working personally with North Macedonia to help them develop their national fintech strategy, together with also funding and support from the European Fund for Southeast Europe's development facility. So as you can see, you'll find a lot of examples of fintech within certain countries, and you'll find lots of regulators. Almost all countries have some kind of an innovation hub or a sandbox at the regulatory level. So it's something that obviously is happening across the globe. Now, in order to develop the strategy, we need your input. So we're going on doing a landscaping survey, really just to get your thoughts. We could sit in an ivory tower, look at what's done in other countries, and come up with some recommendations from a consultancy perspective. But obviously, those may not be appropriate for your situation. So therefore, it's really crucial that we get your input and you have an opportunity to shape the fintech strategy. We're also, through that process, we discover opportunities and benefits, because if you don't convey those, then it's not very attractive for people to pursue fintech or to bring about certain digital transformation and change. So we try and highlight benefits, and again, we're getting that from you, from the market, rather than again, theoretical aspects. And at the same time, by engaging with you, and Milos gave some examples of some of the barriers and challenges that you face, which then we need to factor into the fintech strategy to decide, okay, how do we overcome some of these barriers? So capital adequacy is a classic one. All fintech companies face that across the globe. In places like the UK, for example, we've got something called a registration approach. So you can register with an organization, with a regulator. You don't have to have any capital requirements. There's a light touch sort of licensing process until you get to a certain level where phase 2, where you're starting to make more money or starting to process more transactions, you then become more formally regulated. So that's just one example of how these barriers can be overcome. So, that's kind of the overall aspect. The journey we've gone on so far. So we progressed through stages. I think early in the year, we had a workshop with the regulators and the Ministry of Finance and Government, just to contemplate, what's happened so far within Montenegro, and then the merits of, having some kind of a fintech strategy. So we had that discussion. I think on the back of that, the decision was made to go ahead through that process. We're now going through a consultation process. So the first part of it is surveys. Once we get results of the surveys, we'll publish that. We'll come up with some kind of high-level recommendations, and then we'll go back out to people like yourselves, different stakeholders, and then get a validation on some of the recommendations that we're coming up with. That will help to drive the strategy. So, the strategy will be an overarching document which contains all the recommendations that we've come up with and we've consulted you on. But also we'll put in place some sort of a mechanism for implementation. Because as we said, we don't want this thing to just end up on the shelf. So we give you some idea on, okay, how can you create some sort of structures to implement this strategy? And then obviously in the next phase, you then go down into implementation. And what I've seen in other countries is people get together, either in form of committees, working groups, etc., and you implement in a cohesive way. The approach we're taking is we understanding sort of the driving force for change. So some people start with a fintech strategy because others are doing it, and that's probably the wrong approach. The right approach is why do you need, and I think Zorica started off with the question of why do you need fintech in Montenegro? And so this process today, as well as a survey, will really get us to understand why there's a need, and we can make it sort of more objective. We then assess the environment, so we understand what's going on currently, and the survey is going to give us a lot of that information, but also having discussions with people on the ground. So what's happening at government level, what's happening at regulatory level, as well as what sort of fintech firms are coming about, etc. We explore the benefits by asking you and the challenges, and then all of that feeds into developing the regulatory strategy. I think as Zorica highlighted, the concept of a fintech ecosystem is important. So, the regulators could have decided, okay, we're going to open up the landscape, but if the rest of the ecosystem doesn't work, then, potentially you wouldn't get the same benefits in the outcome. So here's the concept of an ecosystem. An ecosystem, basically, these are the minimum amount of players that are needed to make fintech successful or make it work in Montenegro. So, first you need government to come up with some kind of policy and just a direction. Like Lithuania said, we're going to open up our doors to fintech in order for them to expand into Europe. Malta kind of created the same approach. UK wanted to cement its dominance as a financial player in the world. So, they decided to embark on fintech. So everyone's got their own kind of reason. And government sets out that policy. They then give mandate to the regulators to open the landscape to new players. I mean, there's two ways of sort of digitizing financial services. One is you can rely on the incumbents. When I say incumbents, it's the traditional financial services firms, to go ahead and open the doors to sort of people who are not accessing finance at the moment. The other way is to bring in new players like fintech companies and create a bit of competition. And competition then drives better products and services. I mean, the first option is an option. In some countries, it's the only option. But it is an option. If banks were going to do it, they would have done it by now. So, I think sometimes the second option, which is introducing new players, is probably the better approach. And that's where I think regulators have to come in and sort of ease the way for these smaller companies to come into the market. Because, let's be honest, starting a fintech company is not like starting a small e-commerce company or an e-commerce store. It is a fairly complex process beforehand. and there's a lot of complex licensing aspects you need to factor in before you can launch. And so really the strategy will be there to understand how can those barriers be removed, especially regulatory. You need you need progressive incumbents. So in some countries, the fintech ecosystem relies heavily on traditional banks, for example, to borrow their license or to partner up, because banks have the infrastructure, they have the customers, and they have the regulatory aspects. So partnering makes sense. But also banks can, further financial inclusion and accessibility through, their own means and through their own sort of digital transformation. And then without entrepreneurs, you're not going to get the fintech ecosystem developing. So you won't get fintech firms coming in. So you need that sort of entrepreneurial aspect as well. So these are mainly the drivers of fintech. You then need sort of the whole sort of supportive layer. And the supportive layer is you need consumers who are willing to engage with fintech and who have financial literacy. I mean, if you can have the best sort of infrastructure and everything works, but if consumers don't trust electronic channels, then again that's going to cause issues for fintech companies to get demand. You need infrastructure at a macro level. You need electronic signature. You need digital ID. You need KYC checking. At a micro level, you need firms like Milos who can provide you with a sort of technical infrastructure, to build your business on. And then you need investors, as Milos already said. The investors play a crucial role because fintech does need money to get going. It's not something that you can bootstrap for very long. And at the same time, you need, specialized, in my opinion, you need specialized accelerators and incubators, because again, this fintech business is very different to other types of businesses. And lastly, skills is one of the biggest hurdles that fintech companies face across the globe. There's a huge demand for skills and a shortage of supply. And so, that drives up prices. But in some cases, firms just can't get this kind of skills. So in the strategy, we have to factor in, okay, how do we develop the pipeline of skills in Montenegro? So universities play a key role. And these are kind of the supporters that we need. So this is the ecosystem that we will focus on. And as Zorica said, the strategy will try and come up with recommendations, across these stakeholder groups, obviously excluding consumers, because that's slightly different perspective. We're looking at mainly the supply side. So we will look at all the stakeholders apart from consumers, and we will come up with recommendations for them specifically. And that will form the core part of the strategy. And then we will decide on how to create some kind of a governance framework to bring everything together so that things are implemented in a smooth and coherent way, without people competing with each other. So we've embarked on a survey, as you know, and thank you to those who have participated. If you haven't so far, then please do so, and I'll give you some QR codes where you can access some of the surveys. But really, what we're getting so far is we have the different stakeholder groups. So we've got 7 surveys running at the moment, divided across stakeholder groups. So the traditional financial services firms. So these are insurers, wealth managers, banks, etc. So we've got 207 responses from them. And if you fall in that category, you can use this QR code, scan that right now, and you can access the survey. We've got fintech companies, alternate finance firms, and also technology companies. So we've got about 30 respondents there. 28 from regulators, and I think we're expecting more from some of the Ministry of Finance regulators coming through in the next few days. And I know government has had some system issues, so we're working around that at the moment, and we'll get a lot more responses in the next week or so. But 16 so far, 14 from accelerators and investors, and also some other sort of consultants and service providers. Educational institutions, we've had a really good response. So 27 respondents from there, 19 from associations. So we've just sort of gone out to the Banking Association and the Insurance Association, etc. And we're getting 19 people responding from there. And on the back of this presentation, we're just opening up a general kind of a feedback form for the general public. So, if you don't fit in one of these categories and you feel that you need to provide some input, then, we've got a very short questionnaire, which is kind of launched today. If you want to scan that and you can just provide your input, just to give us an idea of how digital financial services can kind of be enhanced in Montenegro. So all in all, we've got 342 responses so far, and that's growing. By the end of the week, we're hoping to get close to the 400 mark, which is good response rate. And apart from just a sort of yes no select a response, we're also getting a lot of qualitative inputs, a lot of opinions in the forms, which is really fantastic and really giving us some insight into those barriers, challenges, and opportunities. So just so far, I mean, one of the questions we ask is, do you believe there's a need for fintech in Montenegro? And 92% so far said yes. 1% said no. There's only 2 people that said no, really. Some of them skipped now. This was a compulsory question, but these people are still kind of contemplating, and they haven't finally submitted the survey. So it's showing as skipped at the moment. So unanimously there's agreement that fintech is needed in Montenegro. The people that said no, and as I say, there's only about 3, I think 2 or 3 people. They say there's too many banks. 2 people said that. 1 person said so far that the customers don't understand fintech, and therefore at the moment it may not be appropriate. So that's a very small minority, but majority are in agreement. As from next steps, basically, the survey will close on the 16th. We will go and do quite a lot of analysis on the data, which we're getting a lot of it. We'll publish the results in the form of a landscaping report. I believe there may be some kind of an event following that, just to publicize the results. On the back of that, we'll come up with some recommendations and then consult you again, the different stakeholders, to try and understand whether the recommendations that we're coming up with are appropriate. And also we will be discussing with government and regulators around the kind of governance and implementation mechanism. And finally, that will lead to the development of the strategy, which will contain the governance framework as well as the recommendations for all the different stakeholder groups. And I think we have a fairly aggressive timelines. I don't want to commit to that, leave that to Zorica. But this is something that has to happen fairly quickly, so that we can get moving in the right direction. So that's all from me. I'm happy to take any questions. And I'll just stop sharing my screen there. That's my contact detail if you need to get a hold of me.
So thank you, Jay. So now it's time for questions, or maybe suggestions and proposals. So please, colleagues, if you have something to add related to this topic, now it's time. Maybe in the meantime, when you consider what could be shared with others, I will maybe try to read one of the questions arrived before during that registration phase. So let's say, when it is planned to enable the use of international payment services in Montenegro. So it's not so directly related to this, but okay, there is some considerations and questions a lot. So Zorica, maybe you can try to share some information with our audience.
Yes, thank you, Valentina. Definitely, the questions related to platforms for intermediation of electronic transactions, such as PayPal or Stripe, have been a relatively heated topic, and related especially to the question that when it comes to PayPal service, we still don't have the receipt of money option. What we can say as a regulator, that At the moment, our regulation allows work of these companies within Montenegro, i.e. we have a very, very liberal law which postulates that services of these platforms that are executed beyond the borders of Montenegro are not controlled and doesn't have the oversight of the Central Bank of Montenegro. So in that respect, when it comes to services such as PayPal and Stripe, they could start working in their full capacity in Montenegro as of tomorrow. Legal framework is not an obstacle. I would say that there is a merit if we would point out that maybe the government of Montenegro should be more buoyant in making tighter connections with these companies. We as a regulator cannot actively, given our mandate, cooperate or have direct connections with commercial firms. We are here to create the legal environment, and as I have already said, at the moment, the legal framework allows the work of these companies in their full capacities. Maybe something worth noting that although there is a lot of interest when it comes to work of PayPal and Stripe in Montenegro, I would like to emphasize that at the moment it's very difficult to make a business case. Namely, out of 15.5 billion euros of transactions made in Montenegro, only 7 million, i.e. 0.05%, are made through PayPal. Of course, on the receipt side, there is a lot of potential, that the size of our FDIs, the level of remittances that are coming to Montenegro. And I can testify that definitely there is a potential when it comes to receipt of money option. But at the moment, the usage of PayPal starting from 2013 onwards is not as high as many people think. Moreover, only 4% of payment cards registered of Montenegro are initiating transactions via PayPal. That speaks volumes when it comes to our financial education, but definitely when it comes to, I would say, cooperation and approaching these companies that are very much needed in Montenegro, I would say that the right address is the government of Montenegro, who needs to create a viable strategy in approaching the companies in such a manner that would change their mind in, I would say, enlarging the scope of their services in Montenegro. As I said, when it comes to regulatory framework, it is very, very liberal, allowing these companies to work smoothly as of tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. So if you still don't have question, then I will read another one. Does Montenegro have enough capacity in the area of IT security to support development of fintech products? So Miloš, very actual item these days. Maybe you can share your thinking about, do we have enough capacity in the area of IT security?
I think we do. It's the question that is a little bit more related, maybe, is also to a legislation aspect of it. I think that legislation of Montenegro is in a way limiting us to keep anything outside of Montenegro that is personal information of our users. So that limits us to only possibly some of the solutions that are let's say a little bit more limited. So if we would be able to be on a cloud and use cloud solutions to protect us more on a security level by global companies that are actually being targeted big time on a global level every day, every second, that would be much better. So the question is more of a legislation thingy rather than a capacity. I don't believe that we should be going into building our own stuff in that area, because it's not, I wouldn't say that it would be smart enough, but rather change this. And obviously there is the fact that we have banks in Montenegro that actually have externalized some of this information outside of Montenegro under a special request and so on, because they're subsidiaries of big companies from outside, shows that it is possible, that it can be done, and that it's just an administration obstacle. Tomorrow we are going to be probably part of the EU, and that's just simply not anymore the case that we should go down that path. I think that legislation is too old and doesn't apply to the standards that we have right now. And I'd support a little bit. I just like have a small comment on what Zorica said on a PayPal issue that is always being dragged as something that is missing and so on, and the penetration that the numbers show a different picture. Of course, this is not a market that is primary of any primary interest to PayPal at all, economically speaking. But politically speaking, if we are a country that is trying to join the EU and on the road to join the EU, that's what our legislators and politicians need to do to push PayPal, because they will have to do it once we get on the EU market. So the question is not if, but when. So that also shows that it requires really a lot of lobbying from the institutions, lobbying from the government and from private sector as well, more in the area of this is something that is inevitable to happen at some point in time, but not what's the business sense in it. Because also the small usage of cards and penetration that you're talking about, Zorica, for example, that in terms of how much is being sold on PayPal and so on and being used for this, we don't have shipping that allows us to get the goods to Montenegro without very complex import duties and stuff that goes in. So the end customers are not actually encouraged to use shopping carts that use PayPal abroad actually to get the goods to Montenegro. So everything is a little bit, to a certain extent, also connected in that area. And to me, it's absolutely not an economical question. It's not a question that there is no framework. The framework exists. As Zorica said, they could come, but the question is of who is going to lobby for them to push them to come here before they'll have to join.
Okay, thank you, Milos. In the meantime, I see that Daniela raised the hand. So Daniela, would you like to
yes, maybe a contribution from my side as well, regards to all participants, and maybe all three speakers can maybe shortly comment on my question or topic which is connected with core system of the banks, and what challenges is, or what dangerous is in front of us concerning how quickly and how efficiently banks will be able to compete in this surrounding, which will bring PSD2 and EPIs with their core systems, which are more or less with some traditional architecture. And parallel with that, we will probably face all the other challenges which will be brought with new legislative frame, which of course, again, impose to us to be fully compliant, which is first priority, of course. So what are maybe lessons learned from the region, and what are maybe some, let's say, mistakes which we should not make in this first phase, let's say. And really interesting panel, and of course, one of top priority topics in today, banking in Montenegro.
Thank you, Daniela. So who will answer first?
I'm happy to start, maybe just to give you a bit of my perspective from across the globe. So I think, it's interesting. In the early days, it was always banking versus fintech, and I think the whole markets moved a little bit more towards collaboration, because they both realize that they're good in their own specific perspective, and therefore, one can't compete with the other. So banks try to become like entrepreneurs, but they never succeed, no matter how much they try. And vice versa, smaller companies, no matter how much funding they get, will never be sort of big enough to have the scale that banks have. So I think partnership is one aspect. I mean, specifically with banks, if you don't have competition, then in markets like yours, banks can become lethargic. If you keep on getting money, your revenues from the corporate sector, from government, and sort of more wealthy individuals, then you don't have much incentive to do anything else until obviously fintech companies come along and start shaking up the market space. So I think what banks should be doing right now potentially is firstly to optimize themselves. There's three sort of benefits that you can aim from digital transformation. First one is operational efficiencies. So the big barrier that banks have is that they have huge cost base. And if they can reduce their cost base, then they can become a little bit more competitive, and maybe then still compete with the likes of fintech. So operational efficiencies can be gained through using technologies, automation, AI, those kinds of things. The second part is you can gain more market share through better customer experience. So that's what banks can focus on. And then the third aspect, once you're running efficiently, the third aspect is, okay, how can I expand my revenue? How can I tap into markets that I haven't tapped into before? And that's where I think, new type of business models that are enabled by fintech technology can be quite interesting, as well as partnering with some fintech firms. So, I think that's an interesting area that's potentially, I've seen banks do it in different ways. So either they're partnering up with fintech, or they're launching their own fintech companies. And the way they do that is they actually go outside the current bank, create a whole new company, a whole new brand, so that firstly, they're not limited by the legacy systems. And secondly, they don't taint their existing revenue streams. So they don't risk their revenue streams because it's a completely separate company, completely separate brand. And then they experiment and they behave very much like a fintech firm in that small organization, while their big brother, continue operating as they are. And so I think both those strategies can work quite effectively. So hopefully that answers your question, Daniela.
Yes, of course. I mean, from this side of the story, we are facing lots of challenges, as you probably know, because for all these things you need to made somehow banking core systems reliable and open in some way, with different investments concerning middle layers and everything else, in order for APIs to be supported. And of course, I completely agree that partnership between banks and fintechs must be reached, because banks are on all markets definitely some kind of old architecture systems which cannot be reinvented so easily. So yes, partnerships is something which is not be, I mean, that's the only solution. Yeah.
Yeah, or obviously, as I said, create new ventures completely outside the bank. Yeah. And then you're not constrained by a current system. You just buy a system and you're up and running within a few weeks.
Okay, thank you. Milos, you want to add something? Sorry, it's also, so Milos first raised the hand. Please.
Thank you. So as a company that works with many banks in Montenegro now, and I would maybe try to address Daniela's question more in detail, in the sense that we work with different core banking systems. It's true what you're saying. However, these banking systems don't work only in Montenegro. They work also in other countries where they have built already modules for PSD2. And so, it's not something that is that far out of reach. I'm not going to be naming banks now or companies. It doesn't really matter to this extent, but there is a way to get this on board. It's a question of will and how much they'll be pushed by the Central Bank of Montenegro. In the end of the day, if you think about all our applications for e-banking, for mobile banking, and so on, that we have built for the banks, we're already behaving with that single bank like a PSD2. So we are not actually working directly on a core banking layer. They have built something on top. We are using the APIs. So, it's not that far away. Obviously, it requires a different approach with PSD2, but it's not something that they don't know how to do or that it can't be done. So basically you don't have that many vendors of core banking systems in Montenegro. So if you put them next to each other, it's pretty easy to get them on board and actually do this once they get a mandate, and they don't try to prolong it as the others did, as I said.
Okay. Thank you, Milos and Zorica.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Daniela, for the question. We hear you as a regulators. We are very much aware that under PSD2, one of the most impacted parts of any banking parts will be definitely the core banking system, given that the banks will need to open to third-party providers. Of course, the issue of strong customer notification is additional issue. What we have observed with other regulators, that although PSD had some interim period for implementation within the EU countries, some of countries needed a bit more time. So in that aspect, I believe that you are as well aware of the fact that we are giving 1 year for adjustment period, and of course during that part you will not be alone. You can count on very heavy technical assistance from the National Bank of Belgium, MasterCard, and other institutions who are private and regulators who are very proficient when it comes to implementation of PSD2. So in that aspect, you can count on the regulators' patience. It is definitely a structural shock to the system. It will take the changes to the core systems, but as Milos said, it is much easier when we have the situation that many of the banks have already done it within the EU and the region. So in that aspect, I think with all the support from the regulators, regional regulators, EU regulators, we can go through this process smoother than expected.
Okay. Thank you, Zorica. So we are running out of the time. Maybe just one final information from my side is not related to the strategy, but is related to the fintech. So we have ongoing second fintech hackathon in organization of the Central Bank, ICT Cortex, and Association of the Montenegrin Banks. This year we have a regional competition. We have very interesting topic, so I invite you all to participate. All information you can find on our website of the Central Bank of Montenegro. We have also specialized platform for hackathon, Tai, so you can also find information there. So all of you are invited. And thanks again for your interest and your patience and your, let's say, cooperation. We are, of course, here to bring that strategy together. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our guests.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
You too.
Have a
Bye.
nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.